Tako, torej lep pozdrav vsem skupaj. Za začetek vas bom nagovoril v slovenščini. Moje ime je Boštjan Jerman, sem svetovalec za Slovenijo pri informacijski službi Združenih narodov na Dunaju. Torej, na kratko bom povedal, kako bo današnji dogodek potekal. Na začetku bom naredil kratko predstavitev gospoda Davida R. Boyda. Sledil bo seveda njegova predstavitev, katere so ključne ugotovitve njegovega uradnega obiska, in potem v zadnjem delu seveda bo vesel, da bo sprejel vaša vprašanja. Rad bi vas tudi opozoril, da imamo tudi simultano prevajanje, tako da za tiste, ki potrebujete v slovenščino in v angleščino in obratno. Tako lahko tudi seveda vprašanja zastavite v slovenščini, kolikor želite. Tako da za začetek, torej David R. Boyd je posebni poročevalec za človekove pravice in okolje. Je izredni profesor prava, politologije in trajnostnega razvoja na Univerzi Britanske Kolumbije. Kot posebni poročevalec Združenih narodov za človekove pravice in okolje je njegova vloga spodbujati izvajanje obveznosti človekovih pravic, ki so povezane z pravico do čistega, zdravega in trajnostnega okolja. Ključna naloga je izvedba obiskov držav in priprava javnih poročil o teh obiskih, ki jih predloži Svetu Združenih narodov za človekove pravice. Ta poročila opisujejo tako dobre prakse, kot tudi izzive pri varovanju človekovih pravic in okolja. Namen današnje tiskovne konference je, da David vsem skupaj predstavi svoje glavne ugotovitve ob koncu svojega 8-dnevnega uradnega obiska v Sloveniji. Seveda bi vas rad še opozoril, da pravzaprav bo formalno poročilo objavljeno tudi še marca 2023 pred Svetom za človekove pravice in takrat boste tudi seveda lahko dobili še dodatne informacije na to temo. So, now I would like to introduce the next speaker. So David R. Boyd will take and actually present to you the main findings of his official visit in Slovenia. Thank you, David.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you for joining us here this morning. It has been an absolute pleasure to spend 8 days in this very beautiful country of Slovenia, where nature is everywhere and the people are incredibly friendly. As my colleague has said, my goal on these country missions is really to learn what the primary environmental and human rights challenges facing a country are, and also to identify good practices that other countries in the world can benefit from the Slovenian experience. So we'll start with the good side of things. Slovenia is a global leader in the recognition of the fundamental human right to live in a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. It's remarkable to think that back in 1974, Yugoslavia became the first country in the world to include the right to a healthy environment in its constitution. And over the course of the past 4 years, I've worked closely with diplomats from Slovenia to achieve historic resolutions, both at the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly, that recognize this right to a healthy environment. So my visit here is really to have the opportunity to compare those inspiring words with the practices on the ground here in Slovenia. And Slovenia has demonstrated leadership in nature conservation. So for example, Slovenia has a higher percentage of its land protected by Natura 2000 sites than any other country in Europe, which is terrific, and obviously a good way to protect biological diversity. Slovenia has made incredible progress in solid waste management over the last 20 years, going from one of the worst countries in the European Union in terms of sending garbage to landfill to a country that now ranks 3rd in the European Union, very close behind Germany and Austria in terms of the percentage of waste that is being collected for recycling. And another area where I was surprised to learn of Slovenian leadership is in the field of environmental taxes. So taxes on pollution, carbon emissions, and chemicals is a place where Slovenia is #1 in the European Union in the percentage of total tax revenues that come from these environmental taxes. So these are all very positive things. And the last thing I'll say on the good side of the ledger is the city of Ljubljana is an incredibly beautiful city that has made great strides in terms of a whole range of environmental practices. I'm particularly struck by the large car-free zone, which is an absolute pleasure to wander around in. And so Ljubljana has much to offer cities of the world in terms of leading green practices. So that's the good side of things. And of course, like all countries, Slovenia has its challenges. And the challenges I'll really focus on here this morning involve water, air, climate change, renewable energy, and what I call the implementation gap. And I'll come back to that later. In terms of water, I mean, this is a country that is absolutely blessed by its natural heritage of water. And people clearly have a deep connection to water, which is why you have the right to water was added to the Slovenian constitution in 2016. It's why there was such overwhelming support in a referendum to reject changes that would have weakened water legislation. And 99% of people in Slovenia have access to safe drinking water. But, and it's a very big but, there are people in this country who do not have access to safe drinking water. I traveled to the Roma community of Dobruška Vas and was really shocked to see the living conditions of people there, drawing their water from a stagnant pond. And there's just absolutely no way that in the year 2022, in a wealthy country like Slovenia, that people should be living in those conditions. They don't have access to drinking water, they don't have access to sanitation, they're not connected to electricity. So it's really important that Slovenia prioritize taking steps to ensure that everyone in this country, 100% of the people, have access to safe drinking water. And then I was also surprised, we traveled to Anhovo as well, and there's another community there with over 1,000 people where they have had recurring serious problems with their drinking water. Spills of industrial chemicals, oil spills, high levels of turbidity, and so the people again and again are being told by the municipality they have to boil their water in order to make it safe for drinking. So those are two examples of communities in Slovenia where urgent action is required to ensure safe drinking water. Another problem which Slovenia faces is air quality, and there are reports by many different international agencies illustrating that approximately 1,000 people every year die in Slovenia because of exposure to poor air quality. Levels of respiratory diseases in children are 3 times higher in areas that are more polluted than less polluted. And even a beautiful city like Ljubljana ranks 279th out of 344 European cities in terms of air quality. So there's quite a bit of work to be done, and there are what we call pollution hotspots. So again, Anhovo, where you have this community which for decades was subjected to horrible health impacts of asbestos exposure. So I met with people who had lost close friends and many family members to these horrible asbestos-related diseases, asbestosis, which is a degenerative lung disease, lung cancer, and mesothelioma, which is a type of cancer caused only by exposure to asbestos. So you have this population that's been through that historical trauma, many of whom themselves have respiratory illnesses related to asbestos exposure, and yet they are right beside this large industrial facility that is generating high levels of air pollution. So in places where there are vulnerable populations like that, it's critical that the government of Slovenia take action to reduce the burden of air pollution. Talked about climate change briefly at the outset, and climate change is impacting every country in the world. Here in Slovenia, I don't have to tell you that this summer you had a large wildfire, the largest wildfire since independence. You had heat waves, you have a drought that's affecting access to water on the coast, impacting agricultural productivity. And so it's a bit of a surprise to learn that Slovenia has not been very effective in taking climate action. Slow progress on renewable energy, slow progress on energy efficiency, and not very ambitious targets for the future, whether it's 2030, for example, the goal for 2030 to reduce emissions from the agriculture sector by just 1%. This is not in line with what is needed globally to address the climate emergency. We also traveled during our short time here to the lower Sava River, and we visited the new hydroelectric project at Brzice, and apologies for my pronunciation of these Slovenian place names. But there's a proposal for a 5th dam further down at Mokrice, and that is in a Natura 2000 area. So it really is contradictory to have this strong priority on nature conservation, which is an important part of the Slovenian culture, and to propose building hydroelectric facilities in Natura 2000 zones. So I encourage the government to reconsider that plan. And the last thing that I want to mention, and then we'll open the floor to questions, is what I referred to earlier, which is the implementation gap. So there are a number of European Union environmental directives on single-use plastics, on waste, on air pollution that have not been properly transposed into Slovenian law. And there are a number of other European Union environmental directives where Slovenia is not in compliance. And so the European Commission has commenced what are called infringement proceedings against Slovenia, which ultimately will result in the country being taken to the European Court of Justice for failing to do its job in protecting the environment. And I think one of the biggest reasons for this implementation gap is that the government is not allocating sufficient resources to environmental protection. So, for example, in the European Union, the average government spending on environmental protection is 0.5% of gross domestic product. Here in Slovenia, it's only 0.3%. So that's a substantial gap. And the European Commission has, in its reports, indicated that there's this financial gap in terms of investing in protecting the environment, which I think is really important. The good news is that, as I mentioned earlier, Slovenia is a European leader in terms of environmental taxation, and currently those environmental tax revenues are about 10 times larger than what the government is spending on environmental protection. So my recommendation to the government is to earmark some of those environmental taxes and allocate them directly to environmental protection, improving air quality, ensuring safe drinking water for 100% of Slovenians, and taking stronger climate action. So there you have it, kind of the good and the bad, and I'm welcome your questions about anything that I've referred to or anything else that you'd like to ask me. Yes, please.
You've met the representatives of the government. So what was the response to your, what do you say, to your report or to your suggestions?
Yes, we had a debriefing with the government yesterday afternoon, and they indicated that they would take all of these recommendations very seriously. They acknowledged that these are substantial and important problems. They said, of course, that they're working on them, that they have plans to address some of them. And we had, I think, a constructive conversation about the importance of being more ambitious and accelerating the rate of action, particularly for these communities that have these long-standing problems. And one thing that I wasn't aware of before I came here, but for example, in the Roma community of Dobruška Vas, this is not a new problem. This is a problem going back decades. And there are some examples of good practices in Slovenia where these issues have been resolved, in Puška, for example. But my colleague, the special rapporteur on the rights to water and sanitation, visited Dobruška Vas in 2011 and made the same recommendations that I'm making in 2022. The Council of Europe Commissioner for Human Rights visited this same community in 2017, made the same recommendations. So there's clearly a problem here that's not being solved. And under Slovenian law, pursuant to the Roma Community Act, the national government has the opportunity to step in and solve these kind of problems, but it takes that leadership of the national government to do so. And I'm really hopeful that this additional attention that my visit has brought to that situation will result in the government taking those leadership actions.
I have a question, Martina Gojkošek from Slovenian Press Agency. How did you decide which parts of Slovenia to visit, which communities to talk to?
Yeah, prior to coming to Slovenia, we had a dialogue with the government about where it might be interesting to go, and we also had a dialogue with civil society organizations in Slovenia. So we got a range of suggestions, and of course, because it was a short visit, we couldn't go everywhere. So we went to we selected some of the areas that we thought sounded most interesting, and they did indeed prove to be very interesting.
One more, when it comes to the renewable energies, you mentioned this contradiction between nature conservation, and there is a need to get more renewables, happening in Slovenia. Do you have maybe a recommendation, like if Slovenia decides to stop the Mokrice plant, what are the other options?
Yeah, so it's interesting. The Mokrice plant would generate less than 1% of Slovenia's electricity needs. So I think actually when we talk about renewable energy, we have to say one thing first, which is the first priority should be to become more energy efficient, because then you need less of any kind of energy that you build, any kind of energy that you generate is going to have impacts. So by increasing energy efficiency and reducing the amount of energy required, you're doing things in the kind of correct order. I think the sun is shining right now. There's terrific solar potential here in Slovenia, and the cost of solar electricity has gone down by almost 90% in the last decade. So it's previously it was seen as kind of too expensive. That's no longer the case. You make the initial investment and then it's really a terrific investment because there's no payment for the sunshine coming down. I think there are opportunities with respect to wind as well, and that's one area where again there are some trade-offs that need to be made, but wind power is very promising. I understand there's some potential geothermal electricity for Slovenia, and so I would encourage the government to look at the lowest impact forms of renewable energy before approving projects on the beautiful rivers of Slovenia.
Do you have an opinion on nuclear energy, nuclear power plant?
Yeah, I mean, Slovenia is fortunate to have the one existing nuclear power plant because it does provide baseload electricity. And I think that the reality of nuclear is that it's very expensive to build new nuclear power plants. It takes a long time, and it comes with an array of other environmental and security challenges related to the spent fuel rods from nuclear power plants, and also security issues related to radioactive materials. So there are challenges with respect to nuclear, and so I would say it should kind of be the last option. If you're unable to, through energy efficiency and renewable energy, to meet your electricity needs, then nuclear is worthy of consideration.
Maybe another one.
Please.
Somebody else has questions. We're living in, let's say, challenging times, especially Europe is preparing for a hard winter.
Yes.
It will affect consumers, households with high costs, especially high costs of energy. How do you see this issue when it comes to environmental human rights? Because it is kind of related through the
Absolutely.
issue of, the energy, and everything else. How do you see this impacting maybe Slovenia or Europe in general?
Yeah, this is a really important issue, and the reality is what this current energy crisis is telling us for the umpteenth time is that we should have moved faster towards energy efficiency and renewables. So, I just completed a country mission to Portugal. Portugal has, over the last 5 years, really aggressively invested in renewable energy. So they went from 40% of their electricity generated by renewables 5 years ago to 60% today. They'll be at 80% in 4 years. They'll be at 100% by the end of this decade. And what they found is that their energy costs have gone down, their energy security has gone up. And so they're really, I think, a leading example of how taking these steps that I've outlined earlier in terms of energy efficiency and renewable energy should be top priorities going forward, because this current energy crisis may well not be the last energy crisis. In terms of dealing with the imminent winter that is before European countries, I think it's appropriate for governments to focus support on people who are living in energy poverty, for example. I think there was kind of a too rapid reaction to give subsidies to everyone. And the reality is you don't need to subsidize wealthy people's use of energy. Governments with limited resources should be targeting those who really need that support. And also, subsidizing, for example, continuing to subsidize people to drive is really problematic in the context of the necessary transition to different forms of mobility. You know, walking, cycling, public transit, building the rail network. One thing I was really surprised by here in Slovenia is how difficult it is to travel by rail and how excellent the highways are. I mean, clearly there has been a priority given here to private vehicle infrastructure, and that's another of my recommendations to the government, is to really redirect that financial support towards rail, towards public transit. And in cities like Ljubljana, you have tremendous potential for cycling and walking. And some progress has obviously been made, but there's more that could be done. So that was a bit of a long answer to your question, but thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, maybe I'll ask another question. Is this difficult winter ahead of us enough good excuse to continue burning coal?
Yes. So we have known about the problem of climate change since 1992, when countries of the world agreed to the Framework Convention on Climate Change. And so that was 30 years ago. And I really believe that in wealthy nations, all coal-fired power plants should be closed as soon as possible. Portugal, again, to use a recent example, Portugal, which is, you know, not a wealthy nation like Norway, Portugal closed its last 2 coal-fired power plants last year. So I think, you know, Slovenia's plan is to close its coal-fired power plant by 2033. I just don't think that that reflects an appropriate degree of urgency given the climate emergency. Another thing I didn't mention, but I would like to just touch on, is the fact that, as you're probably aware, Slovenia has been sued by a British company for 500 million euros because that company was asked to carry out an environmental impact study prior to commencing fracking operations. These types of disputes between foreign investors and national governments are becoming increasingly common around the world and increasingly problematic in the context of the urgency of addressing the climate crisis. Studies have shown that if all of the countries of the global north were to take the actions needed to meet their commitments under the Paris Agreement, they could be liable for up to $340 billion in compensation to fossil fuel companies. So I think that governments like Slovenia need to look at these international trade and investment treaties to which they're parties and make their strongest efforts not only to defend themselves against these types of cases, but also to renegotiate these terms of the treaties so that these types of cases are no longer possible. And maybe one more thing I'll say in terms of the question that was asked about the government's response. The government's response in terms of air pollution was that Slovenia has been making progress over time in improving air quality. And that is true. Over the past 20 or so years, air quality in Slovenia has definitely improved. But it's similar to someone who used to smoke 2 packs of cigarettes a day and now smokes 1 pack of cigarettes a day. That's better, but it's still not healthy. And the air quality in Slovenia is still not even close to meeting World Health Organization standards for healthy, clean air. So just to be clear on that point.
So maybe just about future procedures. Now you will prepare an official report that will be presented in spring next year.
Yes.
And then what, Slovenian government response, or is there a debate about it?
Yeah, so I'll actually send the Slovenian government a draft copy of the report weeks in advance. Then it will be presented to the Human Rights Council in March, and usually the government that is the focus of a country visit will have an opportunity to respond to the report there. And I've indicated to the government of Slovenia that I'm quite happy to carry on a conversation. I do have a lot of good practices from around the world that could be implemented here in Slovenia, and so I'm hopeful they'll take me up on that offer. If there's no further questions, I suggest we call it a morning and go for some more of that excellent Slovenia coffee.
Najlepša hvala vsem.
Thank you very much for your time today.